Thank you very much to Fee and Carl and Ruth and everybody for letting me be a part of this. It's a really exciting conference to be a part of. The first thing, and this in some ways is one of my most important slides, everything that I say is my personal opinion and doesn't reflect the views of the National Institutes of Health or the US government, which is where I work. And this is going to be the format of my talk. I decided I was going to do it as a listicle, so a set of points. 5, I'm going to try and say things that, at least to some extent, are practical. And then there's going to be 2 things that are kind of like wildly blue sky things that I care about a lot. And I really just want to envisage a world where we actually do have a research nirvana. But it's not research nirvana from the point of view of researchers, which would be a very different list of points, I think. But it's from the point of view of people who need to be served by research and people who try to use it. Now, in this research nirvana, the first thing that I would have is that nobody would ever have to ask any form of what on earth did they do. This forest plot here is just, it's not real, it's just made up. But if that third thing, that third trial there, that's sort of showing a real effect on making reproducibility better, if there was something that could really do this, then really being detailed about what people did before they started, having registered protocols, being clear about the methods of everything that they did, including the interventions that they used, so that you would know if you wanted to do something or you wanted to avoid it, exactly what was it. This would be the single biggest thing, I think, that would probably make a difference to the quality of research. And I think that it has a lot to do with a range of other things, because a group of things travel with this, those issues like reporting guidelines and all of those sorts of processes, because if you're going to do all of this thoroughly and well, these things sort of go along with it. And in addition to that, it actually makes a lot of other things easier for other researchers, and including people doing methods research to find out which are the best, most effective methods. So I kind of see all of those things together under that. My second point I'd make, I used to be a consumer advocate for a really long time. And when I used to train other consumer advocates, getting people to think hands up who's not here was always the main thing that I actually really wanted people to go away with, to sort of really embody and think about. In my research nirvana, we would systematically address patient and community needs. And by that I mean the actual systems and the way we do research would embody it. And in fact, at the moment, healthcare research systematically in some ways does the opposite. So think about issues around drug trials in children, for example. I mean, we have really quite systematically, we actually don't address patient and community needs. And I think that one of the reasons that we don't is that we don't use qualitative research enough. Both to find answers to things, but then to inform other research. Or if people use qualitative research, they do another new bit, but they don't go and have a look at the qualitative research that's been done and draw the lessons out of that for a wider group of people, including the people who aren't necessarily that easy to reach. And again, that hands up who's not here issue. When I used to work at IQWEG, the German Health Technology Assessment Agency, doing knowledge translation for consumers and assessing research for consumers. And we used to start with doing an assessment of qualitative research, research on barriers to adherence, information needs, issues around emotions throughout the entire patient journey. And only after that would we then go and start to try and assess the evidence with this kind of list of what patients' questions were. And it was really quite striking how distant these 2 sets of questions tended to be. The kind of emphasis of what the things were that clinical researchers were researching and had answers to very often was almost in inverse to the things that actually we could see that patients really wanted to know and we wanted to be able to give them good evidence about. And I think as well as that, we're never really going to get to this point until we have a more diverse group of people in the research community. Because a lot of those issues, so for example, how very often we'll get to the end of something and say we don't know enough about people with more than one condition. We don't know enough about women. We don't know enough about people of low socioeconomic status or of this race or whatever. I think part of the reason for that is because we just don't have a diverse enough group of people doing the research. And that includes different disciplines and so on. Nobody talks like this. Nobody answers the question, how are you, with about a half a standard deviation below the mean. Now, we have this kind of argument in the whole evidence movement that what we need is two things. We need to improve everybody's literacy, scientific literacy and their statistical literacy. And then we need people to do knowledge translation, to communicate the results of research to people. Well, newsflash, this isn't going to happen. The wide community and clinicians are never going to understand this. They never will. And I think I can actually make quite a good case that a lot of the researchers using these statistical terms actually don't understand them entirely either. And I think that this is an absolute cop-out. And I really think that we kind of need to get past that problem that we have, that I, in that terms of like trying to be a knowledge translator, would always be facing. That you have inevitably a process of working out the outcomes that you can research that can show differences between groups and so on. How you do that and what's a robust way of doing that without going that next step often of how do we actually translate this back into something that is going to mean something to clinicians and patients in a way that they can actually make a decision based on their own values, not somebody else just saying this is better than this and this improves something or other. So I sort of think that issue about trying to improve those ways of communicating is absolutely critical. And we have a body of evidence in this field that tends to be in very unrepresentative groups of people, very artificial circumstances that aren't anything like the way people actually encounter and use information in their lives, and very often done by people who are proponents of whatever the technique of communication is. And it really isn't serving us very well. There's a kind of a level of certainty about ways of communicating things that's out of all proportion to the quality and generalisability of the evidence that's behind what people are arguing very strongly we all need to be doing. In my research, Nirvana, we would also have reconceptualised what the systematic review is. And I'll say a little bit about this because I think it's quite important. In many ways, we've treated systematic reviews as though they're articles and as though it's a frozen sort of snapshot in time that then goes out of date. And on one level, you can sort of see why we've done that and why we treat it that way. But in actual fact, I think it's more useful to think of a systematic review as an ephemeral artefact of a range of processes with components of enduring value that never go out of date. And if you start to think about that, you'll actually start to think about systematic reviews in a different way. We have this problem that people are getting confronted now with a whole lot of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have conflicting messages, that have got sort of ask slightly different questions, have little bits of differences in what they've included and what they haven't, different methods and so on. And it ends up extremely confusing. And we're not actually going about this process of establishing systems that enable people to compare and build on systematic reviews very easily. And I think that we're in danger of repeating mistakes that we've made before. So I see a lot of arguments of people saying, okay, now the answer is to have a particular type of living systematic review, or we'll all do these network meta-analyses and we'll make those living network meta-analyses and so on. And it really reminds me of the times that the discussions that we were all having at the time that we all established the Cochrane collaboration, where we also similarly had these ideas about the answer and the one size that would fit all that everybody should conform to. And that included things like that you only needed one systematic review. Well, I think that turns out to have not been a very good idea. We had this idea that you should update every single systematic review every single year, that we should have a systematic review for every single question, that every single trial that had ever been done should be in a systematic review. All of these things turned out to be not at all workable. as the people who sort of struggle really hard to try and make that a reality found. And I think we're at risk of actually doing the same thing with the ideas that are around now about how we go forward. I don't think that you can have just one individual way that everybody is going to conform to, nor is it actually desirable. But right away, we could actually start to look at the components of systematic reviews and not sort of ditch them as though they're done with after a few years. Pull out the things that are really quite important. The way people did their search strategies, what studies they found, the quality assessments that they made about systematic reviews. And above all, also get beyond the language barrier for these things, because we're at this point where systematic reviews in health technology assessment agencies, in the Cochrane collaboration in various places, have ceased to grow. They've kind of plateaued, or they're sort of falling back. And we really cannot afford, I don't think we ever could, to leave so much behind the language barriers as we have. We really do need to extract out those components of enduring value that are happening in languages other than English and get a better base for all the people who are trying to do systematic reviews and try and keep on top of evidence. And I think that does apply a different approach. I mean, it's something that we're going to be trying to do more and more at PubMed. And at PubMed Health and in PubMed itself to get past this notion of what up-to-date means and how you actually approach a systematic review and sort of actually kind of unbundle it. I put a lot of things in one here that you could just put under the issue of openness. And this is, in some ways, this may seem like it should be under the pie in the sky list, not the practical ones. But we actually have a thing that affects all of science, all of research, including health research. And that is that we come from a kind of a history where it was a kind of privileged, rich Europeans often, or privileged people in whichever society were sort of developing science and the scientific culture. And a lot happened sort of behind closed doors or sort of behind red velvet curtains or something. And there's an awful lot of kind of secrecy and not sharing in science. Part of that is to do with the issues around what life was like before there was the internet. But a lot of it is actually very cultural. And there isn't a real tradition of actually being really open. But I don't think that we can ever actually get past a lot of the other problems that we've got until we truly grapple with this one. And very often we're seeing kind of things develop that actually kind of add in more secrecy and so on to the system, whether it's peer review, whether it's post-publication peer review. And I don't think that those things are, I think those things are actually antithetical to science and to kind of knowledge actually developing among people. Because in that kind of exclusivity, ignorance kind of thrives because people go and use information that's easier to access rather than perhaps the thing that they would really like to read or that they really need to read and use. Rivalry thrives, discrimination thrives, conflicts of interest can be really well hidden because very few people have got the opportunity to detect conflicts of interest in the groups of people who are involved. And so consequently, it ends up being a very, very serious problem at all sorts of levels. And so I think that's one of our really big challenges. Included in that, I've put the issue of a post-publication culture, and that is to not think of a publication as being some kind of like endpoint. In fact, it's actually often, hopefully, a beginning of a conversation and use. This is where we get to, this will be my most pie-in-the-sky one. I kind of hear about all these things that people want to edit genes for. And I'd actually like to edit the genes of researchers and scientists. I'd like to make them more generous. And this came out of a process of sort of looking at the discussions that are happening amongst philosophers and scientists around what are the norms in science. And even amongst the people who are debating what they should be, generosity very rarely comes up. And I don't know what it would be that each of you might think about that you would like to sort of change the sort of social culture and of science, but I don't think just changing things like incentives and so on is actually going to get at this issue. This is a sort of a cultural issue and a social norm one that goes beyond that. And I think we actually have to think more about how do we actually change that culture. And that culture is something that we're actually all a part of and that we're all creating every single day ourselves and contributing to in some way or other. But I do think that we actually have to learn how are we going to change that sort of deep level of culture. And then I think that this is a really important one. The most important bias that we have to deal with is our own. It really is. And for every researcher and every person who uses research or tries to communicate it to others, we really have a problem with our own cognitive biases and whatever we do that kind of serves our own interests, whether we're aware of it or not. There's this really excellent paper by Scott Lilienfeld and colleagues where they make the point that we've made far more progress in cataloguing cognitive biases than in finding ways to correct them. Now, it may turn out that this is kind of a fool's errand and it's too hard, but we haven't put enough effort into finding out whether that's actually true or not. There are some people in evidence-based medicine who've done some work around that, around trying to test ways of reflexive professional practice and so on, that actually give you some hope that there are ways that we could actually learn to de-bias and to encourage other people to de-bias. And I would suggest that if we actually cracked this one, a lot of the other problems would solve themselves, at least a little bit, if enough people were able to get to this place. And I don't think we would just have a research nirvana then. I actually think it would be good for society. Thanks.